Right. Looks like we're live, I hope. Give people a few minutes to jump on. Thank you for watching this. This is the first class in the Metaphysical Mysteries School. I'm going to just make sure I don't have any technical difficulties because I'm doing this live at the moment. So I'm going to make sure I'm up and running, and then I'm going to hit record. So, looks like I'm good. So I'm going to hit record. I want to thank everybody for joining me, whatever time, whether you're watching this live or at a different time. So what I'm hoping is that if I have trouble with streaming, which I've been having some trouble with on Sunday mornings with stuff that I've been doing, that I'm hoping at a different time that I don't have trouble, number one. And number two, I'm recording and hoping that Zoom records it. And so if there is trouble when it starts, if it does, that Zoom will pick up the recording and the class will be preserved. So I want to welcome everybody. This is a class that I'm doing live on my Facebook page. First class is free for a class that I'm going to be doing called Metaphysical Mysteries. And I'm really looking forward to doing this class. If you're interested in joining the class, it's going to be $300. It's going to run through the middle of July, every other week, every other Wednesday night. And you can go to my website, theawakeningscenter.org, theawakeningscenter.org, and go to the give link and give in the give link and just put in the comments that you're interested in taking the class. I'm setting up a private Facebook group for it. So I'll be doing the live teachings and posting them there. And so they'll be preserved, and also we'll have discussion, and I'll be doing some extra things throughout the week and stuff as well. I see a few of you are jumping on, so I trust that everything is working like it's supposed to. Give me one more second here. So good to see everybody tonight. So I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to be covering in the next 5 classes. So I'm going to switch to my notes here and make sure I don't miss anything. I'm going to cover 7 Hermetic principles of the Kabbalion. I'll be talking about that more tonight, as I'm going to give an introduction to what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to be covering the 3 levels of the mind and how to work with them: conscious mind, the willful mind, the initiating mind, and the subconscious mind. And I'm going to be talking about the superconscious mind, which gets into the rest of the consciousness that's out there, or the mind of God. I'm going to be giving an overview of the history of humanity, what we know about the history of humanity and the origin of humanity, and talk about what is called the primordial wisdom, or the ancient holy wisdom, or the Western mystery tradition. And I'll get more into that tonight as well. And so I'm really looking forward to all of that. Again, it's good to see everybody that's jumping on. So I haven't done this before. All the teaching that I've done, except for on my Facebook Lives, but as far as classes and stuff, all the teaching that I've done has been live teaching. I used to be for those of you that don't know me, some of this is going to be review, probably for most of you that are watching live, you've heard this before. So I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible so that I don't bore you. But for those that don't know me, I'm Aaron Tomlinson. I was a Christian minister and pastor, ministered on several different levels for almost, let's see, I got my first job in ministry when I was 18 years old. And so for 30 years, I was a Christian minister. I was a pastor for just about 25 years, a senior pastor. We founded our church. And I did a lot of stuff. I won awards locally. We manifested, I'll talk about this in a minute too. We manifested and paid for 2 facilities so that we were totally debt-free on both those facilities, eventually totally debt-free on the facility that we have now. And we did a ton of mission stuff, man. We gave all kinds of money. I was trying to think of the different works that we supported over the 20 years, and I just couldn't even keep track of them. But we supported orphanages in India, works in India that were helping the poor. We supported orphanages in various parts of Africa. We sent out missionaries. I was privileged to travel and minister in various parts of the world, doing leadership conferences, speaking, doing all kinds of different conferences. We trained all kinds of people to do stuff. We had a lay counseling ministry that we ran in our city where we saw hundreds of people and provided quality counseling. We did that for a number of years. We won Best Place of Worship in Pueblo, the city that I live in currently, and where I was a pastor. We won that for, I think, 3 years in a row. We took second or third a few years before that, but we won first place, I think, 3 years in a row. I won some individual awards as well. So all of that to say that I was pretty successful in ministry. Served on the board of directors of many different ministries and nonprofit organizations. And at some point I went back and got my education in psychology. I graduated summa cum laude. I'm proud of that because I was not a very good student in high school or through my academic career, but by the time I'd reached my 30s and went back to school, I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in psychology, and then I graduated with honors as well in my master's program, and I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling. I'm currently serving as a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado, as well as what I'm doing ministry-wise. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of who I am and my background, and that is not what these courses are going to be about. So in 2013, I had an experience that completely shattered my paradigm of life and of who I was. And I went through this process that many are calling Christian deconstruction. So what we mean, if you're not familiar with the term, what we mean by deconstruction is you go through sort of this existential crisis. You have certain beliefs that you're deeply invested in, that you're actively involved in and acting upon in your life, that you believe 100%. And then you get exposed to things that cause this cognitive dissonance. You get exposed to information that's completely other than what you believe. And it takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of integrity. It takes a lot of intellectual honesty to come to grips with the fact that what you've been devoting your life to for 25 years maybe not isn't exactly what you thought it was. And so I started to go through this process in 2016. It actually happened to me in an instant in an encounter that I had. And I might as well tell you about that now. Again, some of you have heard this before, so please bear with me. But on August 13th, 2016, I laid down to pray and to meditate, and I had a spiritual encounter. I had a sort of an out-of-body experience, and I won't go into all the details of it. But at this point in time, we were riding high. We had just won the previous year, as I said, I'd won an individual award. Our church had won the Best Place of Worship in our city. I had an international profile. I was doing leadership conferences in the United States as well as overseas. I was recognized as a prophet. I was a full-fledged, born-again, spirit-filled, tongue-talking, blood-washed child of God. And I wasn't just a member of a church. I had actually started a church from scratch. And we had just purchased our second building, and we were growing and we were expanding. And I laid down and I had this encounter. And without going into the details of the encounter, because I don't want to take the time for it here, all I can say is that in 20 minutes, my life was wrecked because I realized after all of the time and effort, and money and travel that I had spent going to Christian conferences, trying to figure out how to be a better leader, trying to figure out how to be a better husband, better father. You know the drill, right? Better Christian, all this stuff that we can take and we can apply to our lives. And I saw in a moment, it was the closest thing I've ever had to a Paul on the road to Damascus type of experience, where I saw in a moment the futility of all of that, the deception in all of that. And out of that experience then came an invitation to find self-love. The question was, could I learn to really, really love myself? And so there was an invitation into self-love and self-compassion, as well as doing real shadow work, which was something that I'd never really done before, something that in the Christian church, in the Christian world, we don't talk a lot about. We don't really have any patterns or pathways forward for us to begin to do that. We end up demonizing parts of ourselves, thinking parts of ourselves are unacceptable to God, cut ourselves off from our, what some people would call our lower nature, but really I just call it our humanity. We cut ourselves off from our humanity in pursuit of the spiritual realm, in pursuit of this life of perfection to be like Jesus. And we end up creating this horrible trash heap of what Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we want to disown, that we want to hide from other people. And so, literally in 20 minutes, the best way I can describe it was I went into that encounter feeling good. I came out of that encounter feeling like I had climbed the ladder to success, only to get to the top of the ladder and discover that it was leaning against the wrong building. And all my dysfunction and things that I carried was staring me in the face. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm a licensed professional counselor, so it didn't, it just made sense to me to go to professional counseling. And as I was having this sort of existential crisis, one of the things that my counselor asked me to do was to take a sheet of paper and to sit down and say, okay, write down, what do you believe? What do you believe about God? What do you believe about yourself? What can you hold on to from those previous experiences that you can bring with you into the present and into the future? And I sat there with a blank sheet of paper for a long time, the first time, and I couldn't come up with anything because I wasn't certain about anything. I really was rattled and shaken. And so I pulled out the Nicene Creed, which begins, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And by that time, I was beginning to recognize that there were feminine attributes to the divine, and that we couldn't define God simply in terms of the masculine or as our Father. And so I didn't get very far with the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. I looked at that and I thought, I'm not sure I believe any of this anymore. And so that page stayed blank for a really long time. And unless you've been through this process or something similar, it might be hard for you to relate. But when you believe something so passionately, and you invest yourself in something so passionately, and then you find out almost in an instant that it isn't what you thought it was, it really rattles you. And one of the things that it does is it causes you to not necessarily trust yourself, because you feel like you've been fooled on many levels, and you wonder, at least I did, what was it within myself that allowed myself down this path as much as I did. And so I did a lot of reflecting on that. And the one thing I didn't want to do was jump into the next thing that looked exciting or sounded right or felt right, and find myself being led down this other path. I think I should mention one of the things that's interesting for me is when I talk about this, people in the Christian community will often throw out at me, well, you can't trust your experiences, meaning you had this vision, you had this encounter that was mystical, that was supernatural, and that could very easily be the devil trying to lead you astray. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light to deceive you. And so with the spiritual crowd, they would just write that off. Obviously, with the biblical crowd that didn't believe in modern day manifestations of dreams or visions or gifts of spirit, they'd written me off already. But there was another part to this that I haven't really shared that as I was thinking about it today is, so I wake up from this experience, and the next thing I know, not literally a week later, I hadn't planned this, I didn't know about it. Literally a week later, I'm on an airplane to go to a Christian event. I got invited to this Christian event that was literally by invitation only. And it was a meeting of the minds, if you will, at least from the charismatic, spirit-filled, prophetic movement perspective. And I find myself in this meeting with some of the top spirit-filled Bible scholars and professors in the world, as well as some of the top big name preachers in the world, as well as some of the guys that lead some of the biggest churches in America, the owners and operators of Trinity Broadcasting Network were part of this meeting. There's about 200 of us there. I get invited, I'm literally on a plane a week after I have this experience, and I go and I sit in this meeting. And because my perspective had changed, and because I was able to have dinner with these guys and really one-on-one talk with these guys, what is God saying to you? What is God doing? What are you thinking? And I really did come to the conclusion that they didn't have much of a clue what the future held or what really God was doing. They were all struggling on some level. Now we all struggle, so I'm not faulting them for that. I'm not judging them for that. And that's not even what was significant out of that experience. What was significant out of that experience was I met a guy who was talking about two authors that I was familiar with. The first author was Matthew Fox, and the book specifically was called The Original Blessing. And the second author was a guy named Greg Braden. And I had read a lot of Greg Braden's stuff in the early 2000s. This was 2016, August of 2016. But I had an interesting reaction to the Matthew Fox book, The Original Blessing, because I had picked up that book in 2000, just a couple months after I had started pastoring. And I was already at that time starting to go through sort of a crisis of faith. And yeah, right. Just starting my church, just starting pastoring and having a bit of a crisis of faith. Really good, right? And so I was reading Matthew Fox and I was reading The Original Blessing, and I absolutely hated it because I thought it was complete heresy. Matthew Fox is a Roman Catholic, and the idea behind the book, The Original Blessing, is a contradiction to the Augustinian concept of original sin. And he traces what he calls creation spirituality, or the positive mystical path, down through the ages within as a stream within the Christian church. And I thought it was total heresy. And I actually ended up throwing that book away. So 2016, 16 years later, I sit down with that book and I begin to read that book. And he begins to contrast in the book the difference between what he calls a Christian spirituality that is based on sin, fall, and redemption that starts with original sin in the garden, or a Christian spiritual path that's just as valid, that's just as historical, that goes all the way back to the time of Christ, that begins with the original blessing and creation, and he called that creation spirituality. And everything he said in there about the negative fruit, the bad outcomes of sin, fall, redemption spirituality, I had experienced in my life and ministry for the last 16 years of my life. And everything he was saying about creation spirituality and the positive mystical path was coming alive in me at that time. And it was a very emotional experience for me, because I thought I had the opportunity to embrace these truths when I was just getting started. Now, remember, I'm just a couple of weeks off of my existential breakdown experience, the vision that I had. And and I would get excited when I would read the book. I would get angry when I would read the book. I would cry when I would read the book. At one point, I threw the book across the room, not because when I was younger, in 2000, I threw the book across the room because I thought it was heresy. In 2016, I was throwing the book across the room because I was like, damn it, why didn't I listen to that? In 2000, I had an opportunity to spare myself and save myself from so many trials and tribulations that I experienced. So I'm bringing that up because at that same time I read The Original Blessing. I read Pete Enns' book called The Bible Tells Me So, which presents a solid, well thought out, intellectual, scholarly critique of the idea of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is the word of God and that the Christian path is the only path. And as I read that book and I was intellectually honest about that book, I began to see all of the flaws and all of the contradictions and all of the problems with the Bible specifically, and with the doctrine of biblical inerrancy especially. And then the third thing I did was I got into the writings of Rachel Held Evans, who's passed on, very tragically, her life was cut off very early on, but her writings deeply impacted me. she kind of, the book I was reading, she kind of approaches the apologetics aspect, because I had learned apologetics early on, how to argue the faith. Why do you believe what you believe? How do you know what you know? And she just systematically undoes all that stuff. So if you can imagine, I have this experience. I get on this airplane. I end up in Florida uh, at this meeting. I come home from the meeting. I start reading these books. I start reading Greg Braden again. What Greg Braden is saying is making so much sense to me at that time. A couple months later, I go to a Greg Braden conference and absolutely fell in love with the man, with the message, with his approach, his style, everything about the event. I just fell in love with. And then I'm reading these books that are just intellectually taking apart my belief system and showing me the flaws. And this is happening in a really fast span of time. So you can imagine the existential crisis. You can imagine why I was sitting there with a blank piece of paper. And so what I'm going to be teaching in this course coming up that I'm doing on metaphysics, this is the first class. So in this course, Metaphysical Mysteries, is I'm going to give for you my blank piece of paper filled out. I have found a place where I feel comfortable at the moment, where I feel it has honest validity, intellectual integrity, scientific backing, and results. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight and in the classes going forward. It's going to be my answer to my therapist in 2016 of what do you believe, what can you hold on to? Now, a lot of people that deconstruct end up in atheism. They end up really angry. They end up really bitter. It's interesting to observe because they don't really change their spirit. They are just as evangelistic about atheism as they were about, I'm assuming, as they were about their Christianity. They think atheism is it. They don't want to have anything to do with anything to do with God. They don't want to have anything to do with spirituality. They are completely sold out to the materialistic model that this 3D world is all that there is. And I completely understand how they get there. The reason I could not go there is because my life was marked significantly throughout my years in ministry by the supernatural, by something else out there that I thought we had all the answers to from the Bible. Now, I think I should confess that I did come, my first time that I went to church, I went to church with a drug problem. And I don't know if I've ever confessed that before publicly, but I had a drug problem for many, many years and staying in church, trying to get out of this drug problem. And what I mean by that was my mom, I was born into a Christian family, and my mom drugged me to church as an infant. She drugged me to church in my toddler years. She drugged me to Sunday school. She drugged me to vacation Bible school. She drugged me to youth groups and to retreats. And I remember she would tell me that I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior when I was 3 years old. And I remember, I swear I remember laying on the floor at 3 years old and receiving and asking and praying the prayer for Jesus to come into my heart. And then when I was 18 years old, I heard the call to ministry. So I went into full-time ministry, not full-time ministry. I got a job in ministry right away, went to Bible college full-time and got a bachelor's degree in pastoral theology, served as an associate pastor, children's minister, toilet scrubber, did all that stuff. But I made a commitment when I was 18 that the Bible was the word of God. It was the source of our faith. It was the rule of our conduct. And I needed to go with it. And so if the Bible said it, I believed that that settled it. That's where I lived for many, many years. And as I was reading the Bible, I would see these guys doing incredible supernatural things, right? In the book of Acts, all throughout the Bible, the whole Bible is supernatural. And yet I would go to these churches because I was raised Methodist. I would go to these churches and I wouldn't see the signs and the wonders and the miracles and all that kind of stuff. And I decided if it's in the Bible and if I'm taking all of it, I should be having these experiences. So I dove in head first and I spent most of my late teens and early 20s when many people were out sowing their wild oats or whatever. I was in my bedroom reading the scriptures, pacing the floor, praying in tongues, and got involved with the spirit-filled community. I also got involved with just sharing my faith. I would go out on the streets and witness and pray for people. Bethel, if you're familiar with that, if you come from the same background as me, they had popularized a thing called treasure hunts where they would go find people and they would minister to them with things like words of knowledge, meaning they had information about that person that person you had no natural way of knowing. And so I would go out in the streets at any opportunity. There for a while, I was doing it almost every night and doing treasure hunts back in the late 80s, early 90s. Very committed, very devoted. If you'd stand still long enough, I would preach to you the gospel. My point in all this was I was very devoted to this, but also I was very programmed into it, right? Because I was born into this thing. I was hearing it before I even had a language. I don't know that there was ever a day that I did not pray in my life or that I did not talk to God. So you can imagine when I'm going through this deconstructing process and I'm learning that maybe this isn't all um, uh, what I thought it was, how earth shattering that was for me. And so it's taken me 5 years to put together something to say, how do I preserve what was and bring it forward into what is? I also want to mention, um, because I know there, for some reason, sometimes atheists will watch these uh, things that I'm doing and come back at me that I'm being anti-scientific or whatever. But atheism was never an option for me because of the signs and wonders that we saw. I hosted hundreds of healing meetings where we saw instant healings that were being verified oftentimes by medical professionals. And I'm talking about people who were totally blind who then could see, people who were deaf who then could hear, people who had broken bones that had them mended instantly, people that would get up out of wheelchairs. We had a room in our church where we had wheelchairs, crutches, arm braces, hypodermic needles for things like insulin and stuff like that, where people had been legitimately healed. So that was the healing aspect of it. The signs and wonders aspect of it, we would have meetings where a visible glory cloud would move into the meeting and you could see a haze in the room that would leave a remnant of golden glitter everywhere. We had gemstones that would manifest in our meetings. We had people that would come in that weren't believers, and fragrant oil would begin to pour off of their hands. And I would walk out of those meetings and I would think, how could anyone doubt the existence of God? Now, none of that was fake. It was very important to us that we had integrity. If we prayed for somebody and they didn't get healed, we didn't try to talk them into being healed. We didn't try to get them to believe into being healed. We didn't try to put on a show. We genuinely, from our hearts, wanted to bring healing to people, spirit, soul, and body. So I have all this experience and I'm going through this tremendous deconstruction. So I'm beginning with the premise. The one thing I could put on my page from the Apostles' Creed was, I believe in one God, maker of heaven and earth. And I wasn't even sure there was just one God. I just knew there was something else out there. So I couldn't just go into agnosticism. I couldn't just go into atheism. And I couldn't forsake, I didn't forsake all the good things that were there. We saw people healed of depression. We saw people healed from lifelong grief. We saw people experiencing spontaneous joy. Their lives were being totally changed. It's one of the reasons that we won Best Place of Worship in our community was because we were getting results. Through our counseling ministry, we saw many people. I could tell you stories of people who had been in and out of uh, medical hospitals and psychiatric wards who were suicidal, who they had tried medication and counseling and nothing else helped. And they were able to get completely set free. So we had all this tremendous fruit. And yet, if I was intellectually honest, I'm reading the original blessing. It makes sense. I can see it. I can see the negative aspects. I can see the traumatic aspects of religion. I'm reading Pete Enns, and I can't argue with a thing that he's saying against the inerrancy of the Bible. I'm listening to Rachel Held Evans. I'm absorbing what she's saying. I can't argue with a thing. I'm reading other Bible scholars and other teachers. And like I said, I had to be humble. I had to be intellectually honest, but I had this question in my mind, right? Like this splinter in my brain, to use a term from the Matrix, the old movie now, The Matrix. But I had like this splinter in my brain where it's like, there is something supernatural. in 2008, I mean, the prophetic would move so powerfully sometimes through me in meetings where I could know things about people in specific dates, not general prophecies of God's shutting one door and opening another, but very specific things about events in people's lives and names. And I remember one time I had stumbled upon someone's security password, much to their shock, their password that they used on their email and their bank account and stuff like that. Um, I remember I was trying to think of different examples in 2008, December 31st of 2008, as I was praying into the new year. I had a sense that something, a major shift was coming in the fall of 2008. And I kept seeking God about that. And during the primaries that year between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, they were still battling it out for the nomination. And I had a vision, and I saw the stock market crash, the economic crisis that was coming in the fall very clearly. Spoke it out publicly. Some of the people that are on here probably, if you've been with me long enough, you remember that meeting. And then I prophesied that Barack Obama would be our next president, which was really hard on the prophetic community. Not as hard as the Trump thing, but they thought John McCain was going to win because they were all hot and bothered for Sarah Palin at the time. And they thought McCain would win and die in office. That's how much they thought of him. And Sarah Palin would rise to power to bring this great revival, which of course didn't happen. So I saw accurately. It was, I think, the last week of September, or the first week in October, when the stock market crashed and the bottom fell out of the real estate situation and stuff like that, and the financial crisis hit, which really did shift and turn the tide of where we had been. So I was seeing accurately. I remember prophesying to a person who was a new pastor who was just starting a church. We didn't have our building yet. And we were in a meeting together, and I walked up to him and I prophesied, in 90 days, you guys will have your own building. And I remember after giving that word, I'm like, hey, we still don't have a building, and we've been going for almost a year. And I get a call from this pastor. I forgot about it, but I get a call from this pastor 90 days later, and he says, hey, he said, do you remember that meeting? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you remember you prophesied over me that in 90 days we'd have our building? And I was like, oh, crap. Yeah, I do remember that. And he says, well, today is the 90th day. And I remember thinking, oh, no, he's going to rebuke me and call me out as a false prophet for missing it or something. And he said, I just want you to know I just signed on the contract. Financial miracles. We manifested buildings. We manifested money for buildings. I could go on and on and on and on and on about the miracles and the signs and wonders and the things that we saw. So I'm just trying to give you a window into who I am and into the problem that I had. But so I wanted to discover what's out there. How can I hold on to? I can't deny the supernatural. I can't deny the what some people might call psychic abilities of being able to know things about people that they didn't tell me. I couldn't deny the hundreds, if not thousands, of physical miracles that we had seen. I could not deny the financial miracles that we'd seen, the prophetic words that had come to pass. And yet here I am today, and I no longer identify as a Christian. So what I want to present in this class is I want to present what I have found that's worked for me. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm not trying to evangelize anybody to anything. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. But I just know, and I've got to believe, there are people out there like me who recognize that there is a lot of mental programming that goes into organized religion. And then there's this overlap of spirituality and supernatural and the metaphysical. And so my quest for the last 5 years has been, how do I separate what I know to not be true that I was taught in the Christian faith, what I know to just be flat out harmful and garbage and traumatic and cause religious trauma within the Christian faith, but yet not deny who I was for 30 years of my life and just turn a blind eye to all of the experiences that I had. And so, having said all that, what has worked for me and what I've found has made the most sense to me has been something that's known as Hermetic wisdom. And so I want to take part of this class and introduce the Hermetic wisdom. There's a great book out there called The Kabbalion, which is officially written by authors who call themselves the Three Initiates. Now I want to, and so I want to teach what's in the Kabbalion in this class, and I'll get to that in a minute. But what I began to do was I began to explore every spiritual tradition I could find, from indigenous shamanic traditions to the ancient Western mystery traditions to New Age spirituality to Luciferianism and Satanism. I didn't really feel drawn at all to the Eastern paths of Buddhism or Hinduism. And I figured I'm a Westerner. I'm going to stick with the fact that I was born in the West. By this time, I was starting to consider the idea that maybe reincarnation was a possibility and that maybe we did choose to come here. And if I chose to come here as a Westerner, then I figured in this life that a Western path was what made the most sense to me. So I didn't spend a lot of time with Hinduism or Buddhism and some of those other areas of spirituality. I was exploring what was Western spirituality. And so through that, and then I was digging into science and digging into facts. Because here's the thing, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we know what we know? Not just what do we know, but how do we know what we know? How did we arrive at the conclusions that we've arrived at? I know it's popular to just say, well, we all have our own truth, and I respect that and I honor that. And I believe there is truth to having your own truth. But at the end of the day, how do we know we're just not making stuff up? How do we know we're not just playing games with ourselves and deceiving ourselves? See, that's the question that was driving me. And so, what I'm going to teach in this class is something that I found that fits with cutting edge science and scientific theories. May not be scientific consensus right now, but some really smart people who are using mathematics and data and real science to arrive at some of these conclusions. And then noticing what was the common thread between Christian mystics, Kabbalistic mystics of Judaism, the Sufi mystics of Islam, the shamanic teachings of indigenous peoples, um, and seeing if there was any common thread with that that would match with my experiences so that I could find a place to sort of land the airplane, at least in terms of philosophy. So that's going to be the approach of the class. So enough about me. Let's get into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. I want to talk about the Hermeticism tonight, or what's known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Now, this may be a new term for you. So I'll give you a little bit of history about this. Before I do, though, I want to throw out something that I think is a assumption and a presupposition that we bring with us when we just approach life in general. Now, presupposition is a little bit different than an assumption. It is an assumption, but it's something that usually operates so subconsciously that we're not aware we're even bringing an assumption to the table. We're presupposing things to be true that we don't even realize are assumptions. And one of our presuppositions, I think, that we have in the West especially, is we assume that our society as it is today is the most advanced, the most knowledgeable, and maybe even the most evolved civilization that has ever been. That humanity has progressed consistently upward. And through this consistent ascent of knowledge, scientific knowledge, and understanding, and all this stuff, that we are the most advanced civilization and the most advanced people that have ever been in the history of humanity. That's an assumption that we bring. And I want to challenge that assumption. I want to suggest, what if we're not? What if we're not the most advanced? What if we are not the most evolved? What if we are not the most spiritual? In fact, what if the opposite is true? What if our advances in materialism and science is actually the evidence of humanity's descent from a spiritual pinnacle where we have lost our internal abilities as human beings to know stuff through the intuitive ways of knowing, through dreams, through visions, through what people might call psychic gifts, What if we have the ability to heal without medicine? What if we have the ability to work miracles? And every once in a while, there are people in our society who tap into these innate abilities and give them some kind of expression that we can see, but that as a whole, humanity has abandoned those things and has actually abandoned spirituality. What if the New Age movement, what if Christianity and the Christian religion isn't all there is? What if what's out there in the New Age movement is pales in comparison to what might have existed in past times with past peoples and in past civilizations in terms of their spiritual expression and actualization of the fullness of the spiritual potential that we have as human beings? And what if what we are observing is actually a devolved society, a society that has lost itself in materialism, so that it is easier to deconstruct from a religious faith and become an atheist today and depend on empirical scientific knowledge alone and disconnect from vast, vast regions of reality that exist out there, but that cannot be measured at the level of consciousness that we're operating in, because we've actually lost something, not actually gained something. And what if there were ancient people who were able to do things through a blending of spirituality and materiality that we cannot do because we've lost connection and lost our consciousness so much in this three-dimensional world, so much in materialism, that we have taken what we used to be able to do internally in order to live and to integrate into the natural world, into this three-dimensional world of materialism that we experience. And what if we lost the ability to master things through what we would call today supernatural abilities? And so therefore we have developed technologies outside ourselves. What if there used to be spiritual technologies that allowed people to express the fullness of their potential, both the higher regions and the lower regions? And what if we lost connection so much with that other stuff that we are simply manifesting externally what we used to be able to do internally? What I mean by that is developing things like this. What if there was a society of people that could communicate across time and space without the benefit of technology? What if they could meet in a realm of consciousness and communicate telepathically or talk to each other without having to go through the medium of a computer and an internet? What if we had those abilities and we lost those abilities? And because we're so lost in materialism, we are advancing and externalizing what we used to be able to do naturally. That's my question. So the presupposition I'm challenging here is that maybe we are not the most advanced society. Maybe we are not the most knowledgeable society, and maybe we aren't at the apex of where humanity was, and perhaps we've even been in a decline. So that brings me back to Hermeticism. So what is Hermeticism? Hermeticism began to revive as a knowledge in about the 16th century during the Italian Renaissance, because they discovered documents, ancient documents, that were written and attributed to a person called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Majestic, or Hermes the three times great, Hermes the great, great, great. Hermes was believed in around the time of Jesus and before, going back to at least the 6th century. To at least the 6th century, there was a Greek philosopher who was mentioning Hermes Trismegistus. And he was believed to be a great master of magic and philosophy, who tradition tells us later became deified as the Egyptian god Thoth. So we're talking about a teacher and a teaching and a philosophy that goes back probably at least to the time of Moses, if not before, but it definitely goes back. We can trace it back to the ancient Egyptian civilization. And the god that they had called Thoth. Now, he's mentioned in Greek and Egyptian texts, like I said, going all the way back to the 5th century. I'm going through my notes here. Writers like Plato and Philo inform us that there were Egyptian priests in the Greco-Roman time period who were going around and teaching what they had learned in the mystery schools of Egypt. And what they were teaching was what we now call Hermeticism, or what they would have called back then the primordial wisdom. A primordial wisdom, a wisdom that goes back to the dawn of time, that goes back to another ancient civilization. Now, I'm going to bring up the term Atlantis, and I realize that, man, Gaia and the History Channel and the New Age movement have done all kinds of things with Atlantis. And here again, I want to bring us back to how do we know what we know? Because sometimes we just get caught up in things and we just go with them. Oh, that sounds good, and I'm going to go with that. But we don't necessarily have really good grounding to stand on with it, right? It could just be somebody's idea that they made up and that they're spreading, and we could end up just believing another lie. But understand that Plato himself mentions the lost land of Atlantis in his writings. And he describes Atlantis as a once great spiritual and technological and just society that had eventually become corrupt and had become so corrupt that it was eventually destroyed in a natural disaster. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that Plato claims to have received this wisdom from one of these Egyptian priests, this information about Atlantis from one of the Egyptian priests. And so therefore, this wisdom of Hermes, this wisdom tradition that I'm going to talk about and teach about in the next few weeks, goes all the way back to Plato, which traces it back to Egypt, and from Egypt traces it back to Atlantis. Now, there's debate as to whether or not Atlantis was a real place. It doesn't really matter to me. It's the idea that's important. Whether the idea originated from a real place that existed as a real civilization that was called Atlantis, that was destroyed and sunk in the ocean, or whether Atlantis was just a symbol for another golden age time period in humanity. It makes sense to me if you take time to watch documentaries about the pyramids and how they were built, and not just how they were built geometrically, and not just how they were built architecturally, you know what I'm saying, the architecture of it, but the way they were built in alignment with the stars, the way they were built in alignment with Sirius and the constellations, the knowledge that the ancient people had about what's called the precession of the equinox. I just want to bring this up. So we understand that the sun, as the earth is going around the sun, that the sun appears to pass through various constellations, which is where we get the sun signs in astrology. So if you're a Virgo, or you're a Sagittarius, or you're a Pisces, or whatever your sign is, it has to do with the month of the year and the position of the sun in relationship to the constellations of the sky. What science is now proving is that the Earth, the solar system itself, goes through a precession of the equinox very slowly and very incrementally. And so it's something that was discovered by astronomers as early as, as late as 20 years ago. It was believed that the precession of the equinox was caused by a very slow wobble in the Earth, that the Earth would tilt subtly every about 2100 to 2500 years, that would subtly change the position of the sun in relationship to the constellations in relationship to the equinoxes. That's a lot of information that I'm throwing out at you. It's not my purpose to go into the astrology, but what I want you to understand, now what they're saying is that the whole solar system is actually rotating, just like the Earth rotates on its axis and then rotates around the sun, and the moon rotates around the Earth, that the solar system itself is rotating around some point that they cannot identify in the galaxy, that then causes this precession of the equinox that is only noticeable about every 2100 to 2500 years. So how did these ancient people know these things? How did the Sumerians know these things? How did the Egyptians know these things? This is some of the stuff that we're going to cover in the classes, because I want to suggest to you that perhaps there was an Atlantis, or at least a civilization that had a very advanced knowledge of the cosmos, had a very advanced knowledge of metaphysics, and a very advanced knowledge of who we were as human beings, of who God is and what God is like. And it looks nothing like Christianity. It looks nothing like the Abrahamic religions. It's something that transcends that. And then as we get into this wisdom, what we find is that the seeds of this, you find it in Hinduism, what little bit I know about it. You find it in streams of Shinto, or you find it in Shintoism, you find it in China, you find it in Japan, you find it especially in the indigenous ancient shamanic cultures, and you certainly find it, you find hints of it in the Bible, you find it in the mystical traditions of Christianity, you find it in the Kabbalah, you find it in Sufism. So what I'm suggesting to you is that how do you know that you know? So here's what I'm doing, Aaron. I don't want to get sucked into something else that's just BS. And I want to be able to land on a solid foundation that is more solid than what I had as a Christian, that is more solid than the Bible, that is more solid than the Nicene Creed. And what I found was that this, what they called the primordial wisdom, you could take the principles of the primordial wisdom and you could find it in indigenous shamanism. You could find it in mystical Christianity. You could find it in the Kabbalah. You could find it in Sufism. You could find it in Hinduism. You could find it in the teachings of and spirituality of the ancient Egyptians. And so maybe it's the recovery of something that humanity has lost. Are you tracking with me? Are you following with me? Pythagoras is another one that we know in writings, who was influenced by the teachings of Thoth or Hermes or of ancient Egypt. So that brings me to the book, The Kybalion. Now, I love The Kybalion because it breaks down the 7 main principles of this primordial wisdom. These 7 main principles. And the Kybalion, as I mentioned before, was written by what they call the three initiates. The consensus among people who have studied the Kybalion is that it was probably written by a guy named William Walter Atkinson. And he's someone that I had read all of his books. I have the entire library of his materials, of stuff that he had written before I knew about the Kybalion, and I had read every single one of it. I loved it. I just devoured it. And when I read the Kybalion, I'm reading William Walter Atkinson. I think I got the name right. I'm trying to do it from memory. I think I got his name right. If not, I'll come back and correct it. Because I read it years before I'd read the Kybalion, but when I was reading, it's like, oh, I'm home again. I know this voice. I know this author. So the idea is it's written by him, possibly by Paul Foster Case, and possibly by a third person. I'd also read all of Paul Foster Case's materials before I'd come into the Kybalion. So the Hermetic principles that we'll be covering in this class, I'm going to give them to you real quick, and then we'll kind of camp out on some of them, I think, if we get there. So the 7 principles are this. The first principle is the principle of mentalism, what these 3 initiates called mentalism. And the principle is this, that the all is mind, and that the entire universe is mental. That's the first principle. The entire universe is mental. With my Christian heritage, I go straight to John 1. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the mind, the consciousness, the mental. In the beginning was the mental, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and all things were made by him, and without him nothing was made that has been made. So it's the origin, the source of all things, and everything has consciousness in it. We'll look at that in a second. The second principle of the Hermetic principles is the principle of correspondence. This is the principle of as above, so below, as within, so without. Some science is calling it today the holographic universe. You know, if you take a holograph, what has the image of a holograph that's imprinted on it, that's able to project a 3D image, and you break that thing, like if it was a disc and you break that disc, you can break it into tiny pieces, and the full image of whatever is being projected will be contained in every piece. So this is kind of the principle of correspondence: as above, so below; as within, so without. As is the human being, so is the universe. The universe is called the macrocosm. The person is called the microcosm. To get to know yourself is to get to know the universe. To get to know the universe is to get to know yourself. Principle of correspondence. The third principle is called the principle of vibration. We talk about raising our vibration. What's the vibe that I'm getting? Where's my vibration at? All that stuff. This comes out of the principle of vibration. And this simply says that nothing rests. Everything is in a state of movement. Everything is in a state of vibration. Now, remember, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about stuff that goes back to ancient Egypt. I'm talking about philosophy and teaching that goes back into shamanism and ancient indigenous cultures that just now quantum physics is beginning to demonstrate and open up and to prove, right? Principle of vibration: nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. The next principle is the principle of polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has its pairs of opposites. You have hot and you have cold, and then you have everything in between. You have light, and then you have total darkness, and you have everything in between. You get it. What they would say is that everything in the universe, everything in your mind, everything about the human being, everything has a pair of opposites, male and female. Another example of that, we'll get to that in a second. The next principle is the principle of rhythm. Everything flows in and out, or out and in. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. And the principle of rhythm is in the universe for balance and compensation. Then you have the principle of cause and effect. This gets into the working of miracles. This gets into healing. This gets into manifestation and the law of attraction. The principle of law and effect. That this principle says every cause has its effect, and every effect has its cause, and everything happens according to law, even if you don't know the law by which something operates. The next principle, there's 7 of them. The next principle, the last one, is the principle of gender. Everything is gender. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. And again, this is on polarity. So there's a spectrum in between. So for our transgendered or non-binary friends out there, there's a spectrum. But everything has the principle of gender. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. And gender manifests on every plane of reality. And understanding this principle of gender is really, really important to the working of miracles, to the law of attraction. And it's something I don't hear anyone in the law of attraction community ever address or ever talk about. So those are your 7 principles that we'll be talking about and going into some depth with. The principle of mentalism, the principle of correspondence, the principle of vibration, the principle of polarity, the principle of rhythm, and the principle of cause and effect, and the principle of gender. Now, this leads me to my conclusion that I want to spend the rest of our time talking about tonight. And that is, I want to talk about the conscious universe, or I want to talk about this concept in philosophy called animism. You can think animation, or to animate, or to give life to. So animism is a philosophy that was shared by ancient civilizations and ancient cultures universally. We do not live in a society or a world where animism is talked about or celebrated or considered unless you're into paganism, Wiccan, pantheism, mysticism, some of these other spiritual paths. But science, as it is today, with a few exceptions that I'm going to talk about, has almost completely dismissed animism. So what is animism? Animism is the idea that consciousness exists everywhere and in everything. So that consciousness is not something that is just shared by you and me as human beings. Consciousness is not just something that is also in animals, but consciousness also exists in plants. Consciousness exists in viruses at the microscopic level. Consciousness exists in plants. Consciousness exists in rocks. Consciousness exists in places. Consciousness exists in houses. Consciousness exists over cities. So we can talk about the spirit of something, the spirit of a place, the spirit of an organization, the spirit of a house. Um, that's the idea of animism. And the interesting thing is that our ancient ancestors believed all this, and now cutting edge science is starting to say the same thing. They're starting to come back to where we were. So this is why I feel good about where I'm at, and I feel good about teaching this, because this isn't just Aaron's revelation. This isn't just something I read in a book. This isn't just me substituting the Corpus Hermeticum for the Bible. This is something that's come from 5 years of investigation to say, where are the common links? And so this is something that goes back to time immemorial. And again, I'm going to say it again, and we'll talk about it a little bit more tonight. We'll talk about it more in depthly in class, that science is beginning to also theorize and begin to prove through mathematical equations, and particularly with breakthroughs that are happening now in simulated realities and artificial intelligence. So that's this principle of all is mental and all is mind. We'll go more into this next week, but this is the basis for all of it, that we live in a conscious universe, both seen and unseen, that we have a consciousness, a mind that is interconnected into this web, into this sort of unseen internet, if you'll allow me to use that analogy, of things that are both seen and things that are not seen. And it really is through the power of mentalism and through the power of the mind that we can begin to experience the realms beyond, the metaphysical mysteries, and even get into the mind of God. Now, I mentioned this before, Aaron. How do we know that you're not just substituting the Kabbalion for the Bible? So let's talk about that for a little bit. Now, the Bible, scholarship tells us, archaeology tells us, and history tells us that the Bible was written, redacted, and edited over a span of centuries, spanning from the time of about the 5th century BC and the time of King Josiah until sometime around the completion of a Jewish Masoretic canon. And I know I'm using terms that are not familiar to people who aren't fluent in theology. It's okay. What I'm saying is that there was a rabbinic movement. Rabbinic just means teaching. There was a teaching movement that began about the time of Josiah, really gained traction during the Babylonian captivity before the time of Christ, was really in gear in the scriptures and in the time of Jesus, and then continued for centuries after that until they canonized their scriptures and said, this is what it is. It went through a process of many edits. It went through a process of many redactions. And the truth is, and this comes from scholars like Rachel Elior, who is the chairperson for the School of Jewish Philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I'm talking about world-renowned scholars and world-renowned experts who agree on this, that we don't really know what Hebraic religion was like prior to the time of Josiah, but we can be pretty sure it was not Moses, and it was not law, and it was not Torah. It was not what it became after the destruction of the first temple. There is scholarly consensus. They disagree on the details, but there's pretty much scholarly consensus of any scholar worth their weight in Christian or Jewish biblical scholarship, that prior to the time of Josiah, Moses was not the key figure. The priesthood, the teachers, and the law and the scriptures was not key. The temple was where it was at. The temple is where it was happening. The temple was where the presence of God was. And that these priests who served in this temple, this first temple, and led the Hebraic religion, the Jewish, what we know today as the Jewish religion, were centered upon the temple, the presence of God, metaphysical mysteries, angels and archangels, and was very mystical and very guarded, like a mystery school. And we'll talk about this in the classes that we're going to do. We'll go more in depth. I'm giving you an overview, and then we'll go in depth in the classes. And when the temple was destroyed, Judaism, what we know today is Judaism, the Hebraic religion was thrown in when the 10 tribes were scattered, and Judah and Benjamin, what we know as the Jews, were carried into Babylonian captivity, and the temple was destroyed. That's the time that the rabbinic tradition began, and that's the time when the scriptures began. So here's the thing that we have to understand about the Hebraic scriptures. They were political in nature. They were not spiritual in nature, they were political in nature. But back then, you did not have the separation of church and state. So you see a blending of whatever a culture believed was out there in the beyond, out there in the conscious universe, out there in the unseen, had its physical manifestation in the earthly government. So the Bible itself is a political text. The Old Testament is a political text. It is written by kings, it is written for kings, and it is written to kings. Then it becomes edited, blended, and redacted by scholars, to scholars, for scholars, which is the problem with biblical scholarship today. It's written by scholars, for scholars, to scholars. Nothing to do with us. So that's the first thing you need to understand. It's a political text. Second thing you need to understand that when we look at it, it is racist in the sense that it is the story of how Israel is the chosen people by God and to be the head and not the tail, the lender and not the borrower, above only and not beneath. So it was written by a people who said, we're it. We are the stuff. We are the head race. We are the superior race. We are the chosen people, chosen by the source and chosen by the creator. So it has racism. I mean, that is the story. That is the root of it. It's not equality. It's Israel is the head and not the tail. So it has that embedded in it. We know that Yahweh was a warring tribal God who was very violent, who wiped out civilizations, supposedly. At least the stories there of genocides in the promised land that justifies the entire Palestinian Jewish conflict today. So that energy is in it. So it has the energies of racism. It has the energies of war and strife. And it is governed by fear. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you obey me, I'll bless you. But if you disobey me, I'm going to do horrible, horrible things to you. If I don't like this group of people, I'm going to do horrible, horrible things to them. Right? I mean, that's all throughout the scriptures. And so this was a political text that had adopted their tribal God as the one God. And understand, when Israel's saying we serve one God, they're not talking about one God, source of all that is. They're saying our God, we only worship one God. We don't worship many gods, and our God is the source of all that is. And by the way, he is this tribal God, Yahweh. So you've got that energy in the book, that mentalism, if you will, principle of mentalism. So you've got the mentalism of racism, you've got the mentalism of genocide that's rooted in racism, and you've got the mentalism of fear. You will serve this God out of fear. If you don't serve this God, he will punish you and he will destroy you, even to the third and fourth or fourth and fifth generations. Like you'll be punished for what your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents did. They may have done something 500 years ago. You're going to be punished for it. And there are stories in the Bible, in the Torah, of people groups being punished for things 500 years after the fact that they did to Israel because this God Yahweh is holding a grudge. This is the mentalism and the consciousness that is invested in the Bible. Now, there's love invested in the Old Testament too, but it's love for Israel only. It's love for the Jews only, or those that convert to Judaism only. The rest of them are going to get a major ass whipping, a bloody ass whipping. So that is the energy and the origin and the cause and effect of the scriptures. Now, they're not reliable. They're not a reliable text. They're not reliable because, as I've said, and I'm going to keep repeating, been edited, been changed, been redacted, been changed again, been edited again, and so forth. Right? So then you bring Jesus onto the scene. Now, here's where we get confused too, because there's lots of guys that go around, good friends of mine, that go around talking about they're teaching the Jewish roots of the faith, and they see Jesus and they see Palestine as this pristine Jewish community that believed one thing. No scholar will agree with that. No historian will agree with that. The only scholars that agree with that are scholars who have a very strong confirmation bias because they are Jewish and they have a Zionistic bias to occupy the land in Israel, or they are Christian scholars who are biased to the Christian agenda. Everybody else understands that there was not a Jewish root. There was not one ancient Judaism. There were many Judaisms. You even see this in the Bible. The Sadducees are divided against the Pharisees, who are divided against the Hellenists, who are divided against other groups. We know now from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we had the Essenes who were divided against the entire community. They were completely anti-rabbinic traditions that we think Jesus came out of. The Essenes were completely antithetical to that. You have the Therapeutae, which was another group of uh, Judaism, another stream of Judaism that focused on nature and health of spirit, soul, and body. And none of these groups agreed, and all these groups were at war. Why were these groups at war? Because one of the Hermetic principles is that whatever's in the seed is in the fruit. So if the seed is racist, if the seed is divisive, if the seed has all of this negative genocidal energy and fear, then you can expect to see it. And we've seen it in denominations and church splits and church fights for millennia. We see it in wars still today. So you have that. Remember, it's written by kings, to kings, for kings. So what they did was they projected human king tendencies onto Yahweh and onto God. He sits on a throne. He rules over a kingdom. He has servants and messengers, which are the angelic hosts. And so all of that is fitting under this kingdom sort of structure. You get it? So that there's this projection and almost this projection of the human ego onto God, that he has to just sit back and be worshipped all day long and adored all day long, and is just ruling over in the sky. And if you get his favor, but you never know when he might be in a bad mood and get pissed off and punish you for something. I mean, 3,000 people died in the Bible because they looked in a box. God wiped out 3,000 of them because they looked in a box. Intermarriage was against the law. Slavery was endorsed. All this stuff in the scriptures. So you enter Jesus, and there is not this pristine Jewish Jesus. For sure, there was not. Because number one, Palestine in the area of Jesus was heavily inundated with this Greco-Roman philosophy that had been influenced by the Egyptians and had been influenced by Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus. It's in the Platonic philosophies, in the writings, like I said, of Pythagoras. There were Hindus there, there were Buddhists there. Jesus may have spent time in India. He may have spent time with the Essenes. Probably Jesus is not a rabbinic Jew because he is in constant conflict with the Pharisees, and that was the precursor of rabbinic Judaism. Probably Jesus was a Middle Eastern mystic who was influenced. Now, I'm a person that believes Jesus lived. I don't buy that Jesus was a myth. I don't believe that the evidence is there. That I have not seen the evidence that convinces me that Jesus was not a historical person. And I have seen evidence that convinces me that he is. And it's not just Josephus. There's lots that we can go into there, but I'm not going to go into it. I'm saying that some of my friends out there that think Jesus was a total myth. So Jesus probably was influenced by this Hermetic wisdom. And the reason I could say that is because the Gnostic Gospels that weren't found until 1954, the Gnostic Gospels are the primordial wisdom. And so remember, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were chosen from among scores of other possible teachings and writings about the person of Jesus. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what's called the synoptic gospels. The word synoptic means to see the same, syn as the same, syn as the same, and optic to see. So they're synoptic in that they see the same thing, right? So you get the same story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You're getting the same teaching in Matthew, Mark, and Luke from three different perspectives. So you've got a minuscule example of what it was believed in the first century that Jesus taught. And then you have the Gospel of John, which doesn't jive with the rest of them, which almost wasn't admitted into the canon of Scripture because they thought it was too Gnostic. So you have these guys who are interested in power and in control, who pick Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writings of Paul, who was a rabbinic Jew, who was a Pharisee, and Luke, who was John's companion, and put these in your New Testament canon and call it the Word of God, and they ignore the scores of other books that were out there that were Gnostic, that actually are rooted in the Hermetic wisdom. So here's why I've become convinced, because we're talking about two texts, the Bible and the Hermetic corpus, that come from the same time period, the same seedbed, and the same culture. Only you have one that's very suspect because it's written by a group of people during the time of Josiah. Please understand this. History confirms Josiah onward. There's other historical references in other cultures to King Josiah and the kingdom. There is archaeological evidence for the first temple. There is archaeological evidence for the reign of King Josiah and kings coming after that. There is no historical references in the Egyptian, the Babylonian, or the Sumerian tablets and stuff that we found. Yeah. Granted, to my Jewish friends out there, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. In other words, maybe we haven't discovered it yet. They just discovered the Gnostic library just almost a century ago. So the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. I'll give you that. But the evidence archaeologically for a genocide, not only is it in the Holy Land, you know, Joshua coming in and destroying, Joshua coming in and causing the walls of Jericho to fall, there's evidence that there were no walls in Jericho. There's evidence that there was no drowning of Egyptians in the Red Sea. There's evidence that there was no wanderings in the wilderness. There's no evidence for a Moses. But from the time of King Josiah, now we've got writings from other historians, we've got the archaeological evidence, we've got all that stuff to back it up. All right. So we don't know. But we do know for sure that it probably came into being with Josiah, that it was definitely politically motivated. A book, 2 kings, by kings, 4 kings. I don't want to keep repeating myself. The Hermetic wisdom, what we find in the Kabbalion, was treasured and guarded by priests and passed down through mystery schools, usually through oral tradition, by initiation only, for the spiritual advancement of the initiate, not for the power of a king who's trying to take it to himself, but the teacher empowering the student to become what the teacher was. And I believe the person of Jesus, I believe there's enough evidence that the person of Jesus comes from that same primordial tradition. When you look at the Hermetic corpus, there is no racism. There is no violence. There is no punishment with a God in the sky ready to eke out punishment. There is no fear. There is no basis of if you do these things, you'll be rewarded by the God in the sky, and if you do these other things, you'll be punished by the God in the sky. It's completely clean and pure of all that. You can read it, you won't get any of that. You just get edified. It does not deny the existence or the reality of God. In fact, it embraces an animistic idea, which we'll get into animism more in the teachings of Dr. Donald Hoffman and some other people. Donald Hoffman is a psychologist, um, PhD level, teaches at the University of California in Irvine. There's some other scientists that I can't remember their names right now. One guy over in Holland who's talking about the universe is conscious, and there are higher consciousnesses and other consciousness out there that people called angels, which, by the way, the angels go back to Sumeria and predate the time of the Jews. The concept of archangels goes back and to predate the time of the Jews. Monotheism actually was part of the ancient Egyptian belief system, the belief that there was one God, that there was one source of all of it. So if I compare the texts, I don't have all the junk in the Kabbalion or the Hermetic wisdom that I see in the Bible, but I can preserve everything that I had experienced and everything that I enjoyed about my Christian faith. I just didn't know I'd been programmed with the mixture of the stuff. So the Bible itself is a mixture. There is wisdom and there is inspiration and there is truth and there is good things in the Bible, but it's got all this baggage that you don't find when you study this Hermetic wisdom. Now, that brings me to God, and this is where I want to bring this home. The way Hermes Trismegistus, whether he is a symbol for the origin of the knowledge, both whether he is a symbol for the origin of the knowledge or the actual dispenser of the knowledge, the giver of the knowledge to humanity. The concept of God is very, very different. And maybe one of the ways we can understand this is by looking at creation. When you look at creation from a Judeo-Christian perspective, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We think about it as God like an artist building something or a painter painting something. In this other tradition, what we're talking about is God becoming what God created. That in the beginning was the mind, the Logos, and the Logos emanated out of God's self, the creation. There is none of this putting of ego and human characteristics upon God in the Hermetic concept of God. There is the idea that source, God, is good, has a will to good, and a will to love, and a will to give, and a will to share. That God is an outpouring of grace and an outpouring of love and all those things. And that God became the creation. And that these other consciousnesses arose where we get angels and archangels. And it leaves the possibility for alien civilizations. Because God is the all. God is not a human being sitting on a throne acting like a king. God is in absolutely everything, including in the human being. And because all is mind and all is consciousness, God is this consciousness. And because God is this consciousness and you are consciousness, then you actually are God. You actually are plugged into this. And so it's learning how to operate at these levels of consciousness that allow you to give the expression to the part of the divine that you are, so that you literally reach a state of apotheosis, because that's the other part now. I'm using big terms. Apotheosis means that you become a god. This is the other part of the primordial wisdom, was to understand that you were connected to source, that you always were, and you always will exist as a consciousness, that you exist from time immemorial, and you will exist into eternity future as this aspect of the divine, but that we have lost ourselves in this human illusion. We have forgotten who we are. That's what the Gnostics would say. You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten that you are source energy. You have forgotten that you derive your life from this God. But this God, again, is not human like we think about, but humanity is an expression of God. I'm going to say that again. God is not human, but humanity is an expression of God. Therefore, human characteristics are all divine and godly, or aspects of the divine. And so part of this path and part of this wisdom was to work within your own consciousness, to work within these three levels of consciousness that we're going to talk about in this course, to awaken yourself to who you really are, to tap into the potential of who you really are, to realize that you are connected to this spirit that is holy. And through this Holy Spirit, you are connected to all things. And I believe this was the teaching of Jesus Christ. I believe this is what got Jesus crucified. I believe that it's out of this root of hermeticism and hermetic wisdom that true Christianity flows from and flows out of. So anyway, I've gone just about an hour and a half. I know a lot of this maybe was review. I wanted to give you an idea of some of the new material that we would be getting into. It's my hope, if there's enough interest, that this will become a foundational course that we can build upon, and we can get into things like energy work. We can get into things like ascension. What does it really mean to ascend? We can get into some of this other more practical stuff of the spiritual life, but we have to have some kind of a philosophy or foundation or basis to build upon. And I also wanted to explain where I was coming from, that I'm not just converting to the next latest thing and bringing it out and bringing it forward. So those of you that decide to take the course, the way this will work, you can go to, I don't have a link because God help me, I'm technologically challenged and I'm an even worse marketer. Some of my friends that are charging lots of money for their classes, they've taken marketing classes to know how to do online marketing and Facebook marketing and all that stuff. I have no interest in that stuff. I'm just really not interested in this. I'm not doing this to make a buck. People say, well, then why are you charging? I'm charging because I have found that if people get something for free, they don't necessarily value it. And I believe that what I'm going to be sharing will have enough value that it's not going to, that only the people who will actually value it will pay for it. Now, when I say that, I understand that value is all relative. So if you're in a tax bracket above $150,000, $300 to you is totally different to somebody who's living on Social Security. They're going to value that $300 a whole lot more. Originally, I was going to charge $450, and then I had a lot of people come back and say, "Oh, I can't afford that. I'd love to take the classes." And so I wanted to make it a little bit more affordable. I wanted to make the first class for free available to you. All this information's out there. You can go get it yourself. You can find it in books and on the internet and various different places. Lots of people are putting stuff out. But I want to take what I've learned and bring it together and put it out there for you. And I want people who are really going to value it. So we're talking about 9 hours of classes. We're talking about $33, I think is what it broke down to, an hour. You'll pay more than that for a haircut these days, especially some of you ladies, or you'll pay more than that to get your nails done. So just think about how you value that. Again, because I'm not doing this to try to market myself, but I do want to get an income from the knowledge that I have and that I teach. So I'm being very transparent about that as well. But I'm trying to make it available to as many people as I can make it available to. So you can go to our website, theawakeningscenter.org, theawakeningscenter.org. I don't have a link, but you can go to the website. You can click on the link. You can give in 3 installments of $100 if you want to. You can give all at once. You can break it up into 2 payments. But I just need you to comment, to notate when you give the donation that you're giving it towards the class. Then you have to be on Facebook. You have to have an active Facebook account so that I can invite you to the private group that we're going to be doing the teaching in. And then that's where I'll be doing the lives. And I'll be doing them every other Wednesday. So if you look at your calendar from today, skip next Wednesday, and you look at the next Wednesday, that's when I'll be doing them. And we'll be doing 5 more classes after this, and then hopefully some more classes to come after that. If you have any questions, please feel free to instant message me on Messenger. I'll be happy to answer those questions for you if I can. Otherwise, thank you for taking this time and spending it with me. I'm not giving up putting out free content, by the way. I'm still going to put out free content. This one's going to be a little bit more laborious for me. And that's another reason I'm charging for it. So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. I look forward to reading your comments. And namaste.